It was clear to the victorious allies of World War II, well before the German army surrendered in 1945, that all of German society would need to be purged of Nazi influences and effects, and that the Germans would need to be re-educated in democratic values. It was relatively simple to revoke Nazi laws, remove symbols of the National Socialist regime from the public sphere, withdraw undesirable books from libraries, obliterate swastikas from forms and documents, and change street names. A much bigger problem was what to do with the approximately 8.5 million members of the Nazi Party, and the many millions more from a German population of 70 million who had belonged to one or another Nazi organization. How to denazify them? Today we're going to see how Germany denazified so quickly, and you're going to get a sense of how absurd this whole process was. Before anything else, let's get an overview of it. All around 8 million Germans, or 10% of the population, were members of the Nazi Party. Organizations related to Nazism also had large membership numbers, such as the German Labor Front, 25 million, the National Socialist People's Welfare Organization, 17 million, the League of German Women, among others. It was through the party and these organizations that the Nazi state was run, involving a total of up to 45 million Germans. In addition, Nazism found significant support among industrialists who produced weapons or used slave labor, and large landowners, especially the Junkers in Prussia. The first difficulty was the huge number of Germans who might have to be investigated, and, if support for the Nazi state was found to an unacceptable degree, penalized. In the first months of denazification, there was a great desire to be completely thorough, to investigate every suspect and hold every Nazi supporter accountable. However, it was decided that the numbers simply made this goal impractical. The Morgenthau Plan had recommended that the Allies create a post-war Germany with all its industrial capacity destroyed, reduced to an agricultural subsistence level. However, this plan was soon abandoned as unrealistic and, due to its excessively punitive measures, likely to cause German anger and aggression. Over time, another consideration that moderated the denazification effort in the West was the concern to maintain enough goodwill from the German population to prevent the growth of communism. The denazification process was often completely disregarded by both the Soviets and the Western powers for German rocket scientists and other technical experts who were taken out of Germany to work on projects in the victorious countries themselves, or simply seized to prevent the other side from taking them. The US took 785 scientists and engineers from Germany to the United States, some of whom formed the backbone of the US space program. In the case of high-ranking Nazis such as Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, Streicher, and Speer, the British initially proposed simply arresting and shooting them, but this course of action was replaced by putting them on trial for war crimes at the Nuremberg trials, in order to expose their crimes while demonstrating, especially to the German people, that the trials and sentences were fair. However, the legal basis of the trials was questioned, and many Germans were not convinced that the trials were more than victor's justice. Many refugees from Nazism were Germans and Austrians, and some had fought for Britain in World War II. Some were transferred to the intelligence corps and sent back to Germany and Austria in British uniform. However, the number of German speakers in the British zone was small, which was hindered by the language deficit. Due to its large German-American population, US authorities were able to bring a greater number of German speakers to the task of working in the Allied military government, although many were poorly trained. They were assigned to all aspects of military administration, the interrogation of prisoners of war, the collection of evidence for the War Crimes Investigation Unit, and the search for war criminals. Now that we've seen the overall picture, let's dig a little deeper into the details. Beyond just hunting people so they could be put on trial, the very idea of Nazism had to be rooted out of every corner of the world where it had infected men, women, and, as you'll see, some very angry children. These Nazis could end up anywhere in the world or running Germany itself, so purging them of every Nazi thought in their heads was of extreme importance, but it would not be an easy task. The first thing that needed to disappear was Hitler. The man himself was dead, but there were photos of Hitler everywhere, so now they had to go. It was nearly impossible to go anywhere in Germany without that dead maniac presenting himself in some form. Across the country, nearly 100 streets had been named after Adolf Hitler. With Hitler's rise in the 1930s, Germany also saw many stadiums and bridges named after the Führer. When the war ended, the renaming of these places began in an attempt to denazify Germany. It was a start, at least. It may come as a shock to you that even streets as far away as New York were named after Hitler. It was the work of the pro-Nazi German-American Bund, which named the streets of a planned community in Yaffank, Suffolk County, or as the British press called it, New York's Nazi town. There, Adolf Hitler Street was renamed Park Street, Goering Street was renamed Oak Street, and Goebbels Street was renamed North Side Avenue. The renaming of these streets happened before the war ended, but after the war, there were calls to rid this area of anything remotely connected to the Nazis. We must remember, however, that the Nazis had support all over the world. Fascism wasn't just a German disease, it was a worldwide pandemic. Even in Britain, the British Union of Fascists once marched proudly with an impressive 40,000 members before it was banned in 1940. The end of the war didn't just mean cleaning up Germany, the entire world had to face a reckoning. The lifeblood of Nazism had seeped into the nooks and crannies of cultures all over the world, especially in nations occupied by the Germans, where some people had embraced Nazism wholeheartedly. That was about to change, if not by choice, then by force. And during Denazification, collaborators in countries like Belgium, Norway, Greece, and Yugoslavia were not treated kindly. In Norway, there were thousands of war children, the sons and daughters of women who had associated with Nazis. Once the Germans were gone, not only were there trials for the collaborators, but these women were treated as a disgrace to humanity, spat on, and called traitors and other terrible names. In Norway's legal purge after the war, 40 people were executed, and thousands of Norwegians and non-Norwegians were found guilty of collaboration. Nazi prisoners of war in Norway were tasked with clearing minefields and forced to walk through the fields when they claimed to have finished. If the Norwegians disagreed that the entire area had been checked, the prisoners of war were chased at gunpoint, which resulted in predictably explosive consequences. This was one way of getting rid of the Nazis. 392 prisoners of war lost limbs or were injured in some other way. 275 died. Although this doesn't seem humanitarian at all, it happened at a time when Germans and collaborators were being tried for torture and murder on a truly unimaginable scale. They had committed absolutely barbaric war crimes. But even so, a group labeled the Norwegian Silk Front said that 2 wrongs don't make a right. Another group called the Ice Front said that the Nazis deserved everything they got. This was another thing about denazification. It divided people over what should be done with the Nazis and their sympathizers. France, of course, had a lot of purging to do after the fall of the Vichy regime and the end of the war. Many French citizens collaborated with the Nazis, even if only in thought, not necessarily in action. The country held trials under the Épuration Légale, which lasted until 1949. While hundreds of thousands of French citizens collaborated with the Germans, 6,763 were sentenced to death for treason, while about 100,000 were punished with dégradation nationale, making them second-class citizens. The hero of World War I, Philippe Pétain, who became a Nazi collaborator in the next war, was subjected to national degradation, as was one of the most celebrated and controversial French novelists in history, Louis-Ferdinand Céline, often called a brilliant anti-war writer with ugly anti-Semitic views. But France also had its so-called Épuration Sauvage, which looked much more like the Purge Night from the modern movie. Even those vaguely suspected of collaboration were humiliated and beaten, and sometimes killed. including women who had relationships with Germans, and it's believed that 105,000 people were executed off the books. British military historian Anthony Beevor called it an ugly carnival reminiscent of the Old Testament and the horrors of the Dark Ages, where some people seemed to take pleasure in delivering punishment, sometimes lethal. He wrote, "Many of the punishers had been petty collaborators themselves and sought to deflect attention from their own lack of resistance credentials. Nevertheless, resistance groups could also be ruthless with women. In Brittany, it is said that 1/3 of civilians killed in reprisals were women. Particularly hated was La Milice, the paramilitaries who helped the Nazis fight and eliminate the French resistance, sometimes collaborating with the sadistic Nazi interrogation chief, Klaus Barbie, the same Barbie who, with help from American intelligence, escaped to Bolivia and later conducted intelligence and torture operations for dictators and drug cartels. Even so, many French people were outraged and saddened by what was happening to the men and women accused of helping the Nazis, especially if, as in one particular case, the woman had only been a cleaner in a German military office. These alleged collaborators didn't need to be denazified. They were never Nazis. They just needed a job. One scholar once called it the penitence of the collaborator. Although in many cases, especially where women were involved, evil was replacing evil. The purification of France was not entirely fair. Some argued that the wealthy collaborators and those who profited from the war continued their lives normally, while the poor bore the brunt of the suffering. With all its flaws, many French people praised the previously mentioned author Céline, a wounded World War I veteran, when he said, "Heroic poetry appeals irresistibly to those who don't go to war, and even more to those whom the war is making enormously rich." It's always like that. Even with the worst of the Nazis about to be hanged, or sitting in a prison cell, or even thrown into the Seine, there was still the essence of Nazism to be dealt with. That had to go too. But how do you kill a belief? It was one thing to get rid of real Nazis, but it was another to erase Nazi ideology. This very idea was discussed during a 2-week meeting in the German city of Potsdam between Allied leaders. Before we talk a bit about the Soviet Union, let's look at some very interesting statistics. The US conducted opinion polls in the American zone of occupied Germany. Tony Judt, in his book Postwar, A History of Europe, since 1945, extracted and used some of them. The majority, in the years 1945 to 1949, claimed that Nazism had been a good idea, but poorly implemented. In 1946, 6% of Germans said the Nuremberg trials had been unfair. In 1946, 37% in the American occupation zone answered no to the statement, "The extermination of Jews and Poles and other non-Aryans was not necessary for the safety of Germans." In 1946, 1 in 3 in the American occupation zone said Jews should not have the same rights as those belonging to the Aryan race. In 1950, 1 in 3 said the Nuremberg trials had been unfair. In 1952, 37% said Germany was better off without Jews in its territory. In 1952, 25% had a good opinion of Hitler. British historian Ian Kershaw, in his book The Hitler Myth, Image and Reality in the Third Reich, writes about various surveys conducted among the German population. In 1945, 42% of young Germans and 22% of adult Germans thought that the reconstruction of Germany would be best carried out by a new, strong Führer. In 1952, 10% of Germans believed that Hitler was the greatest statesman and that his greatness would only be recognized at a later date. And 22% thought he had made some mistakes, but was still an excellent leader. In 1953, 14% of Germans said they would vote for someone like Hitler again. Returning to the main topic present were Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, former and current British Prime Ministers Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee, as well as US President Harry Truman. Despite their differences, They had to reach agreements about Germany and what should be done with it. The country had just been devastated, or at least many of its main cities, such as Berlin, Dresden, Cologne, Essen, Dortmund, Hamburg, Hanover, Würzburg, and Nuremberg, had been devastated. About 1.7 million Germans had fled by 1945, and Germans were being expelled from other countries, if not imprisoned or even murdered. The country was in total chaos and needed management. At the conference, it was agreed to divide Germany into 4 Allied occupation zones. Northeast Germany would be controlled by the Soviet Union, while Southeast Germany would be controlled by the United States. Southwest Germany went to France, and Northwest Germany went to the British. The 4 parties agreed that a German government could be formed only if all 4 agreed that such a government was acceptable to all parties. Bomb-shattered Berlin, right in the middle of the Soviet occupation zone, was also divided in 2. Germany was now a divided country, and each division had its own ideas about denazification and what to do with the millions of German citizens who were homeless and unemployed. The Soviet Union was also competing with the Americans, and, to a lesser extent, the British to find the best Germans, including many Nazis, for intelligence and scientific purposes. We will return to this topic later. They disagreed on many issues. The Soviets took a much harsher line than the other 3 nations. For example, the Soviets went after German landowners, even non-Nazis, and confiscated their property. In other zones, they said German political parties had to be part of a communist coalition, which drew much criticism from the US and the UK, since they knew Stalin had big ideas about expanding communism. The British, French, and Americans, recalling what had happened after World War I, were more lenient regarding reparations. The Soviets wanted every drop of German blood, even after the Allies had agreed to dismantle all major German industries and confiscate infrastructure, equipment, natural resources, gold and silver reserves, investments, and tons of money. It was Germany's fault, after all, at least as the Soviets saw it, since Germany had started the whole situation. Still, you can be sure that when Germany fell apart and was being carved up by the Allied nations, some Germans nostalgically remembered the good times when Adolf Hitler promised them the world. And many not only remembered, but acted on it. Trouble began to arise, especially among young Nazis, of which the Allies were well aware. The Soviets had their own way of doing things, which led to their withdrawal from the Allied Control Council. This was a governing body over all occupied zones, regulating what happened in post-war Germany. They created a set of new laws, one of which was Law Number 2, which explicitly forbade anyone from trying to resurrect the National Socialist Party. Nothing even remotely close to the Nazi Party could be formed, and they even banned athletic exercises if considered a type of military training. Under another directive, Nazis could not work in key industries or perform civil service work. Germans certainly could not add to the canon of Nazi literature and propaganda. Nazi books were, of course, destroyed, an action that actually generated criticism. On 27 May 1946, Time magazine wrote, "To re-educate Germany, the Allies last week adopted a typically Nazi device. The 4-Power Coordinating Committee decided to eliminate all literature, museum, and library material, newspapers, films, and war memorials that were anti-democratic, militaristic, and Nazi. They also went after paintings. Hitler had burned and banned books and paintings he hated, calling them decadent and harmful to the German soul. But in their place he had artists paint what he thought were good and wholesome works. These paintings often depicted quiet rural towns and sunsets, not just Aryan-themed battle scenes. They seemed harmless enough, but the Allies said they contained the Nazi ethos, and denazification meant they had to go. One order stated that any art which may tend to revive the Nazi spirit or German militarism had to be destroyed or impounded. A researcher later explained, thousands of paintings were destroyed and 8,722 were sent to U.S. military depots. In 2007, It was reported that the Pentagon still had about 450 paintings that a news article called the U.S. Army's hidden collection of Nazi art. As for the rest, who knows where they went? It seems the prolific Nazi art looters were themselves looted in the name of Denazification. The four parties also wrote Law 10 concerning the punishment of persons guilty of war crimes, crimes against peace and against humanity. The law stated that if anyone is required for trial in a zone different from the one he is in, he must be transferred to that zone rather than sent out of Germany, unless there is an agreement that he will return to that zone after the trial elsewhere. If we look briefly at the matter of responsibility, we see that the ideas of collective guilt and collective punishment did not originate with the peoples of the US and the UK, but rather at higher levels of policy. Only at the end of the war did the American public assign collective responsibility to the German people. The most notable policy document containing elements of collective guilt and collective punishment is JCS 1067 from early 1945. Eventually, horrific images from the concentration camps would harden public opinion and bring it more in line with that of the policymakers. As early as 1944, prominent U.S. opinion makers launched a domestic propaganda campaign, which would continue until 1948, arguing for a harsh peace for Germany, with the particular aim of ending the apparent American habit of viewing the Nazis and the German people as separate entities. Statements made by the British and American governments, both before and immediately after Germany's surrender, indicated that the German nation as a whole would be held accountable for the actions of the Nazi regime, frequently using the terms collective guilt and collective responsibility. In 1945, the Public Relations and Information Services Control Group of the British element CCG/BE of the Allied Control Commission for Germany began issuing guidelines to officers responsible for producing newspapers and radio broadcasts for the German population in order to emphasize the moral responsibility of all Germans for Nazi crimes. Likewise, among American authorities, such a sense of collective guilt was considered a prerequisite for any long-term education of the German people. Using the German press, which was under Allied control, as well as posters and leaflets, a program was conducted to familiarize ordinary Germans with what had occurred in the concentration camps. One example was the use of posters bearing images of concentration camp victims, accompanied by texts such as, "You are guilty of this," or "These atrocities, your fault." The English writer James Stern reported an example in a German town shortly after the German surrender. A crowd gathers around a series of photographs that, although at first glance seem to depict garbage, reveal dead human bodies. Each photograph carries the caption, "Who is guilty?" The onlookers stand in silence, seemingly hypnotized, and eventually withdraw one by one. The posters are later replaced by clearer photographs and placards proclaiming, "This town is guilty, you are guilty," the introductory text of a leaflet published in 1945 by the American War Information Unit. Thousands of Germans living near these places were taken to the camps to see with their own eyes what crimes had been committed in their name. But it is not possible for most Germans to see a concentration camp. This pictorial report. Although the four Allied occupation zones in post-World War II Germany worked together in some respects, each had its own methods of denazification. The Americans, in particular, seemed to put more effort into this process. In 1945, under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, it was written that only a long-term, unyielding occupation could lead Germans to a fundamental revision of their recent political philosophy. Eisenhower was realistic about the timeline and believed that ridding Germany of the Nazis and Nazi ideology would take at least half a century. He had a plan to find the most ardent Nazis, not only war criminals, but also regular members of the population who lived and breathed Nazism. The American position was that if someone had been a member of the Nazi Party since the beginning of Hitler's rise, they were unlikely to abandon the ideology. This group included more than 1.5 million people. However, there were many who were not fervent Nazis, but had joined the party and might accept or abandon Nazism. The Allies agreed to divide these people into 5 categories: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, exonerated persons. Exonerated persons were free to do as they pleased. The other categories faced work and travel restrictions, probation periods, or, in the case of offenders and major offenders, imprisonment, and even the death penalty. When a German was contacted by the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, he probably knew he was in trouble. This intelligence agency, which would later become the CIA, played a crucial role in denazification and carried out many covert operations that only came to light decades after the war. Even those who were not Nazis often reacted badly to denazification. Some felt shame for their country, others were upset by losing the war, and many, especially the poor, saw no hope in their lives. There were also angry Nazis with plans for a Nazi resurgence. Few allies felt sorry for them, especially those who had seen the horrors of the concentration camps and lost relatives there. In a letter dated May 15, 1945, the U.S. Army was informed that the German nation must be made to taste to the fullest possible extent the bitterest dregs of humiliation and defeat. Nevertheless, not all Germans were guilty of crimes, and the Americans faced the challenge of not becoming monsters while fighting monsters. The Americans required all Germans in the American zone to fill out a form to prove the degree of their guilt. This was facilitated by access to the files of all Nazi party members, thanks to an anti-Nazi group in Germany. However, the administrative side was a nightmare, with tens of thousands of forms arriving daily and millions needing to be processed. By the end of 1945, about 3.5 million former Nazis were still awaiting release by the Americans, which meant they could do almost nothing, including getting a job. Germany was partially disintegrated because of this, with many people unable to repair damaged infrastructure and innocent civilians left without food. Amid this chaos, the Americans arrested tens of thousands of people and restricted many others to manual labor. In most cases, the crimes were not considered severe enough to warrant harsh measures. The Americans allowed those suspected of Nazi sympathies to have people testify on their behalf, which often resulted in exoneration certificates known as Purging. However, many Germans also bought fake certificates on the black market. For the Americans, running another nation and investigating millions of people was an enormous struggle. The other 3 occupying countries had similarities with the Americans in their attempts at denazification. In the Soviet zone, many Germans feared the possibility of internment in camps and tried to escape to other zones. Atrocities, particularly against women, were common, and in 1946, Colonel Francis P. Miller testified before Congress about the moral disintegration among American troops, which harmed American prestige. While some were involved in criminal activities, he admitted it was a minority, not the majority. Atrocities were also committed by troops from all Allied armies. Despite the bad apples, there were American humanitarian organizations helping the Germans. All Allied armies committed atrocities against Germans. Some American soldiers sought German girlfriends, and fraternization, known as Gehen Fraten, could cause problems. Many women turned to prostitution, which increased venereal disease rates among American troops, leading to infamous human experiments like the Tuskegee syphilis study. The misconduct of American troops in Germany made headlines at home, with the New York Times reporting on failures in the denazification program and other issues. Although some Allied soldiers were involved in unethical activities, the British were considered less strict than the Soviets and Americans, often due to economic and logistical issues. The French were even less strict, allowing lower-level former Nazi Party members to continue their lives. Denazification was difficult to manage, and the British and French zones became havens for those fearful of retaliation. Britain and France did not prosecute anyone under 18, even though Hitler had indoctrinated many youth. In 1936, Hitler created Nazi youth groups that continued to pose dangers during denazification. In June 1946, the CIC dismantled a group of armed Hitler youth in Schwäbisch Gmünd. The leader, Siegfried Kabus, was arrested and sentenced to death. The CIC dismantled many similar groups in various operations, confiscating weapons and arresting thousands of suspects. While the Soviets were installing communist regimes across Europe, the Americans and British feared the worst, leading Winston Churchill to speak of a Soviet Iron Curtain. The Cold War had begun, diverting resources from denazification to espionage and intelligence concerns. High-ranking ex-Nazis and German scientists became valuable to both sides, and Britain and the US conducted intelligence operations to ensure that valuable Nazis didn't end up on the Soviet side. The merger of the British and American zones reflected the growing Cold War divide, creating a new era of espionage and covert operations. Even while trying to denazify, the Allies' priorities began to shift more toward the emerging global competition between the West and the Soviet Union. As mentioned earlier, it was the CIC that captured the Nazi Gestapo interrogator, Klaus Barbie. According to alliance law, he should have been handed over to the French, but the Americans decided he was useful and placed him on their payroll. The British found him first, but he ended up working with the Americans, something for which the US Department of Justice later had to apologize. A declassified document reveals that in 1951, the CIC sponsored his escape to South America via a rat line operating through Italy. Barbie, like many other Nazis, could be useful working for US intelligence. By that time, Allied denazification efforts were essentially over, at least officially. They were still capturing Nazis, but for different reasons. In Operation Bloodstone, the US sought out Nazis in the Soviet zone and recruited them to work in places like Latin America, where the US would go on to overthrow left-leaning governments during the Cold War. A declassified CIC document states that these new Nazi spies would be suitable for psychological warfare, subversion, sabotage, and various operations such as assassination, target capture, and the rescue of downed Allied airmen. The New York Times reported that about 1,000 Nazi war criminals were hired, some of whom lived in the US under new names. In Operation Paperclip, around 1,800 German scientists, some of them members or leaders of the Nazi Party, worked on US scientific projects. Better in the US than in the Soviet Union, which was also trying to capture and employ smart Nazis. The CIC literally picked up these scientists off the streets and brought them to the US. An order given to a German scientist explained that he should report with his family and luggage the next day at noon. There was no need to bring winter clothes, but family documents and jewelry should be brought. The Alsos mission, started in 1943 and continued after the war, involved British and Americans working together to find useful German scientists, especially those involved in biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. Denazification turned into something else. In Operation Selection Board, British and Americans recruited known ex-Nazis who were very anti-communist. The plan was to lie and promise support to form a government in Germany, as long as they helped fight the Soviets. German war criminals were hired to help find other war criminals who might go to the Soviets. In one operation, 50 Nazis were arrested, and when Ebeling, one of the recruits, was no longer useful, he was killed by a British agent. In 1946, the CIC employed Hildegard R. Springer, also known as Agent Honeypot, who gathered political intelligence on communists in Germany. Eugen Fischer and Anton Mahler, two senior Gestapo officers, were also employed by the CIC after the denazification process. Both were interned in camps, but eventually received clean records after accepting jobs with the CIC. However, Fischer became a security problem for the organization, and both were arrested again in 1949, only to escape. The West German police, who had taken over the denazification process, failed to locate these men. This led to a scenario where spies were spying on spies, creating an atmosphere of widespread paranoia. A New York Times article from 2010 revealed that the United States recruited ex-Nazis. The article highlighted the public outrage over the story of Klaus Barbie, one of the many Nazis recruited and paid by the US, often with money and cigarettes, despite being wanted for extreme war crimes. The article referred to a report titled Hitler's Shadow: Nazi War Criminals, US Intelligence and the Cold War, based on 1,100 CIA files and 1.2 million Army counterintelligence files, declassified in 2007. The Times described how these documents revealed a grim picture of bureaucracy, territorial disputes, and communication failures between intelligence agencies. They also exposed cynical and selfish tactical decisions by the Allied governments, where war crimes committed by ex-Nazis were ignored in exchange for their value as intelligence assets. Rudolf Mildner was one of the individuals whose records were found. He was responsible for the execution of hundreds, if not thousands, of Poles suspected of resistance and helped send about 8,000 Polish Jews to Auschwitz. He worked for the Americans until 1949, before fleeing to Argentina. Reinhard Gehlen, head of military intelligence of the Wehrmacht's Foreign Armies East, was also recruited by the CIC. Gehlen offered his freedom in exchange for access to German intelligence and promised to form a spy organization to help the Americans, known as the Gehlen Organization. He demanded the reinstatement of his former Nazi team, who were released from internment camps. The newspaper The Independent reported years later that the Gehlen organization employed at least 100 ex-Gestapo or SS officers, including Alois Brunner, deputy to Adolf Eichmann, who sent more than 100,000 Jews to ghettos or internment camps and died of old age. The operation, called Operation Rusty, was criticized by the British for being risky, as they believed Nazi spies in the Soviet zone could become a security threat. Major General Joseph Charles Hayden, head of British Intelligence Division, expressed concerns about the operation, which was later considered a total failure in terms of intelligence. Operation Gladio, conducted by the US and the UK, involved creating secret stay-behind operations with armed paramilitaries for psychological warfare and assassinations, recruiting ex-Nazis between 1949 and 1953. Among the recruits was Walter Kopp, a former army officer described by the CIA as an unreconstructed Nazi. Frank Olson, a biological warfare scientist, saw up close how denazification merged with the Cold War. Olson, a captain in the US Army Chemical Corps, worked with ex-Nazis on biological weapons and on the CIA's mind control program, MK-Ultra. He developed chemical mixtures to mutilate, kill, and drive people insane, killing thousands of animals in the process. Olson became disturbed by what he saw in Germany under Operation Artichoke, where the CIA tested new interrogation methods, combining drugs, hypnosis, and torture on suspects considered expendable. Olson, deeply disturbed by what he witnessed, told his wife he had made a terrible mistake. A few days later, he fell from the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York, under suspicious circumstances, while CIA colleagues were in the same hotel. A report on Olson's trip to Germany revealed that he had witnessed horrific and brutal interrogations, which left him deeply shaken and wanting to reveal what he had seen, which led to his security clearance being questioned. In 1957, Germany seemed free of Nazis, although about 77% of the senior officials in West Germany's Ministry of Justice were still former members of the Nazi Party. Many Nazi war criminals were hiding or living under pseudonyms in South America, or the US declassified documents and investigations revealed much about those dark days, but we probably only know half of what really happened. Now let's see exactly how this happened so quickly. The process of removing Nazi ideology from the social fabric of Germany was planned before the end of the war in Europe. The term denazification was coined by the Pentagon in 1943, as they began considering the German legal system in the post-war period. In August 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt was already mentioning the need to instill in the Germans the idea that they had participated in an illegal conspiracy. This objective was formalized at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed that denazification should be a strategic war goal, removing all Nazi influence from public office and German cultural and economic life. The Third Reich surrendered on May 8, 1945, and the push for denazification was reaffirmed in the Potsdam Agreement in August 1945. The Western Allies had compiled a list of 178,000 Nazis to be arrested, while the Soviets had already interned 67,000 Reich officials. To manage this undertaking, the Allied occupation forces needed to clearly declare the objectives and parameters of denazification, as well as the categories and sanctions for Nazi offenders. According to a U.S. State Department memorandum from July 1945, the goals of the denazification program included the arrest of Nazi leaders and other people dangerous to the Allied occupation, the exclusion of Nazi Party members from public office and positions of responsibility in private companies, the eradication of Nazi laws, the dissolution of the Nazi Party and its affiliated organizations, the elimination of all Nazi propaganda, including symbols, flags, and anthems, and the complete removal of Nazi ideology from the German media, educational system, and religious institutions. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.